Have you ever really stopped to think about how laws, the rules that shape our societies, actually come into being? We sort of imagine them maybe popping up fully formed, right? Penned by some great leader in a single moment. But what if the reality is, well, a lot messier, more like a tapestry woven over centuries, layer by layer, with some really surprising twists? Today, on the deep dive, that's exactly what we're digging into. The history, the surprising evolution of law, specifically looking at the Old Testament. And we're basing this exploration, our guide, really, on part 4, chapter 1 of Sir James George Frazer's huge work, Folklore in the Old Testament.
That's right. And what's so fascinating, I think, is how Frazer, using the critical scholarship of his time, really pushes back against some common assumptions about how ancient laws were made. You should definitely expect some aha moments today.
Mhm.
The story behind these foundational laws is frankly much more layered and, well, human than you might think. Our goal is to give you a solid grasp of this often misunderstood history.
Okay, let's dive right in then, because the first big point from this modern critical view, and it does surprise people, is this. The Pentateuchal laws, the laws in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as we actually have them written down today, they weren't just handed down by Moses in the desert. That's a pretty significant challenge to the traditional picture, isn't it? How can something seen as so foundational be so late in its final written version?
It is a big shift in perspective. The scholarly view Frazer presents is quite different. It suggests that this body of law, in its complete written form, actually took its final shape sometime after Jerusalem fell to Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. So we're talking during the Jewish exile, or maybe even slightly after. This means a large chunk of it, especially what scholars call the priestly code, actually dates to a late period in Israel's history, much closer to the end of their time as an independent nation, at least in terms of when it was all put together in writing.
Wow, so the form we read today is a product of much later work. That really changes things. If that final written version came so late, what does that tell us about how laws actually develop? Did they just invent them all in exile? Or is there maybe a key distinction we need to grasp?
That's the crucial question, really. And it leads us to a vital distinction Frazer highlights: the difference between legislation and codification. You see, laws generally don't just spring into existence fully formed, like Athena from Zeus's head, as Frazer colorfully puts it, the moment someone writes them down. Legislation is, the official making of rules. But even brand new laws, they almost never come out of nowhere. They typically build on, or at least assume, a foundation of existing customs, public opinion, tradition. Frazer uses this great image. Society is a growth, not a structure. You can't just demolish it and rebuild it from scratch, no matter how appealing that might sound sometimes. An effective law has to connect with a people's past if it's going to shape their future. He compares it to a gardener. They can cultivate beautiful flowers, change their shape, maybe their color, but they work with existing plants, right? They don't create a rose or a lily out of thin air. Every law, like every plant, has a history embedded in it. If you trace it back, you'd find earlier, simpler forms.
That's a brilliant analogy. And Fraser actually gives some really solid historical examples, not just from ancient Israel, like Justinian's Digest, hugely important Roman legal code. But it wasn't really new laws. It was a massive collection, an organization of older Roman legal opinions and rulings, often using the exact words of the original jurists. It was about making sense of what already existed. Or think about Napoleon's Code in France. Huge achievement, right?
Yeah.
It replaced this bewildering mess of local laws, apparently. Travelers used to say they changed laws more often than they changed horses.
Right, that anecdote really
Yeah.
captures the chaos.
Exactly. But even Napoleon's Code wasn't created from nothing. It drew heavily on Roman law, on existing French customary law, royal decrees, even the laws from the Revolution. So even these massive, seemingly revolutionary legal projects are actually deeply rooted in the past.
And this isn't just a European thing. Frazer points to the Semitic world, too. Take Hammurabi's Code, dating way back to around 2100 BC. It's the oldest big legal code we know of. But even Hammurabi likely wasn't just inventing laws wholesale. He was probably building on immemorial custom and usage, maybe from even older civilizations like the Sumerians, formalizing, refining, yes, but not creating entirely anew. So if we bring this back to Hebrew law, it starts to make sense that many of the laws and rituals in the Pentateuch are, as Frazer says, undoubtedly far older than the date they were finally written down and collected. In fact, he argues you can see traces of very ancient, even primitive practices embedded within them. Things like circumcision or rules about ceremonial uncleanness, say after childbirth, or the use of scapegoats. These weren't new ideas dreamed up during the exile. They point to deep roots, customs that probably go back way before recorded history began. The key takeaway is this long evolution before the final writing.
Okay, This is really shifting my perspective. But it raises a big question. If the laws were written down so much later, what about Moses? Does this diminish his role? I mean, that's a central figure.
That's a very natural question and an important one. But Frazer argues, and most historians would agree, that assigning a late date to the codification doesn't negate the historical reality or importance of Moses himself. Not at all. History shows us, doesn't it, that major religious and national shifts, these huge movements, they almost always have powerful figures driving them. Great men, as Frazer puts it. Think about it. Trying to imagine Israel and Judaism forming without Moses is like trying to picture Buddhism without Buddha, or Christianity without Christ, or Islam without Muhammad. It just doesn't really compute. So while the specific laws, as written in the Pentateuch, might not have come directly from him in that final compiled form, Moses absolutely ranks as the true founder of Israel. He's the one who rallied the tribes, led them out of Egypt, forged them into a people, and stamped his genius on their identity and institutions. He died seeing the promised land, right? His impact was absolutely foundational in shaping the people, even if the detailed writing of their legal code came much, much later. It's about recognizing different kinds of historical impact.
Right, so his foundational role remains secure, even if he don't personally dictate every word of the final text. Okay, but if the law evolved over time, layered like you said, how did this incredibly complex system actually take shape? You mentioned layers. This is where it gets really interesting, isn't it? The idea that scholars can actually peel back these layers within the Pentateuch itself.
Exactly. Critical scholarship identifies at least three distinct groups or bodies of law within the Pentateuch, and they seem to differ quite a bit in their character and their probable date. Let's look at them in what's generally thought to be their chronological order. The oldest layer embedded in the Pentateuch is usually identified as the Book of the Covenant. You find it in Exodus, chapters 20 to 23, roughly, and it reflects a pretty simple way of life, mainly agricultural, where wealth is mostly about cattle, sheep, crops. The principles of justice are quite basic things like direct retaliation, eye for an eye, or paying compensation. Very similar, Frazer notes, to what you might find among, say, desert nomads like the Arabs.
Like blood revenge for murder, that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Though it does mention the idea of seeking asylum at God's altar if the killing was accidental. Self-help justice is prominent. Now, this Book of the Covenant is found within older narrative strands. Scholars call them the Elohistic and Jehovistic sources, based on how they refer to God and other stylistic things. These narratives might date back to the 9th or 8th centuries BC, but the laws themselves within the Book of the Covenant, they were likely customary rules long before that, observed, passed down orally, beyond the memory of man, as Frazer puts it.
So that's the earliest layer, ancient customs written down relatively early, but still reflecting something much older. What comes next as society gets more complex, more centralized?
Well, the next major development is the Deuteronomic Code. This is widely believed to be essentially the book of the law that was famously discovered in the temple in Jerusalem back in 621 BC during King Josiah's reign.
Ah, Josiah's reform. Right, I remember reading about that.
Exactly. And this discovery, or perhaps unveiling, became the blueprint for his major religious overhaul. Two key things Josiah did based on this book. First, he shut down all the local shrines, the high places where people used to worship Yahweh all over the country. And second, he declared that all proper sacrificial worship had to happen only at the temple in Jerusalem. Centralization.
That sounds like a massive change.
Oh, it was monumental and historically incredibly significant. Because this, as far as we know, was the first time in Israel's history that a written code was officially published, backed by the government, as the single supreme law for the whole nation. Before Deuteronomy, law was mostly customary, unwritten. It lived in the oral traditions, the decisions given by priests at various local sanctuaries. They were seen as speaking for God, right? Their rulings were the original Torah, the teaching.
So going from spoken rulings to a fixed written national law, that must have had huge consequences.
Profound consequences. Frazer argues this was really the first step towards the canonization of Scripture. It marked the beginning of the shift from the spoken word to the written word as the ultimate infallible guide for life. But he also sees a downside. He says it laid thought under shackles. Think about it. When law is spoken, interpreted by prophets or priests, there's flexibility, adaptation. But once it's written down, fixed, it becomes stereotyped and immovable. A living growth gets replaced by a dead letter, in his view. The scribe, the interpreter of the text, starts to take precedence over the prophet or even the priest delivering fresh oracles. Israel became the people of the book. Wisdom now meant studying the text, not necessarily direct experience or revelation.
That's a fascinating perspective, the power and maybe the rigidity of the written word. So when was Deuteronomy actually written, if it was found in 621 BC?
Yeah, the composition date is debated. It had to be written before 621, obviously. Maybe earlier in Josiah's reign, or perhaps even during the reign of his predecessor, Manasseh.
Was there any suspicion around its discovery? Like maybe the priests found it too conveniently to push their agenda?
That suspicion of devout fraud was certainly raised. The idea that maybe the Jerusalem priests concocted it to centralize power and, well, income in the temple. But Frazer actually dismisses that. He points out that the code includes provisions for the rural priests who were basically put out of a job by the centralization. That seems unusually generous if it was just a power grab by the Jerusalem elite.
Interesting point.
He suggests the author was more likely a genuine patriot and reformer, someone deeply concerned about religious purity and national identity, someone who blended the legal traditions with the passionate moral urgency of the prophets. The language is often quite stirring, like a preacher pleading with the people.
Okay, so we have the ancient customs in the Book of the Covenant, then this move towards written, centralized law with Deuteronomy under Josiah. What's the third layer?
Right. Now, despite Josiah's reforms and the Deuteronomic Code, Frazer, reflecting modern criticism, suggests this centralization might not have been entirely positive. Philosophically, if you think of God as everywhere, limiting worship to one spot could seem like, well, a retrogression rather than an advance.
Mm-hmm.
And practically, it must have caused huge problems for ordinary people living far from Jerusalem.
Yeah, you can just imagine that, can't you? Frazer uses this really powerful analogy. Think about tearing down all the village churches in England, forcing everyone to travel to London to worship. Imagine being a peasant farmer. Your local hilltop shrine, the sacred tree, the stone pillar where you felt close to God, all gone. Smashed. Now you face this long, hard journey to the big city, waiting crowds.
Feeling God had somehow gone away to the capital, as Frazer puts it. Even if officials told you it was better, you'd miss that familiar local connection.
A real sense of loss.
Definitely. And here's the tragic irony. Josiah's great reformation, all that effort, didn't actually prevent the disaster. Jerusalem still fell, and the people were dragged off into exile in Babylon.
You'd think that would shatter their faith, wouldn't you? Or at least make them question the whole Deuteronomic approach.
You might think so. But Frazer argues the opposite happened. Instead of losing faith, the catastrophe seemed to intensify their commitment to religious observance. Their conclusion wasn't the laws were wrong, but rather we didn't follow the laws strictly enough. This led, especially among the priestly class in exile, to the development of a much more detailed and elaborate system of rituals and purity laws. The prophet Ezekiel, himself a priest exiled in Babylon, sketched out an early vision for this renewed, highly ritualized temple worship.
So a shift towards more ritual, not away from it.
Exactly. A real contrast to some of the earlier prophets who emphasized social justice and morality over sacrifice. Ezekiel puts the focus squarely back on temple rites, priestly duties, maintaining ritual purity. And this emphasis was developed further by the priestly school during and after the exile. It eventually resulted in what we now call the priestly code, or the Levitical law. This is the vast body of ritual, genealogical, and legal material that forms much of the framework of the Pentateuch, especially Leviticus and Numbers. This whole system was formally introduced, according to tradition, by the scribe Ezra around 444 BC, after the return from exile. This priestly code is the third and final major layer of law identified within the Pentateuch. Its late date is considered a cornerstone of modern critical scholarship, and Frazer sees this final stage as marking the transformation of Israel from a nation into a church, where identity became defined primarily by religious observance according to this comprehensive written code.
Wow, what an incredible unfolding from ancient, maybe semi-pagan customs buried deep in the past.
Right.
Through that first attempt at a national written law with Deuteronomy.
Pivotal moment.
And finally, spurred by exile, culminating in this incredibly detailed priestly code that shaped Judaism for millennia. It really shows how looking critically at the sources, like Frazer did, can completely reframe our understanding of history and religion itself.
It really does. And if you think about the bigger picture, what does this whole story tell us? About how laws work, how societies change, maybe even how faith interacts with the written word. How does that very act of writing things down, of codifying, change a living tradition, for better or for worse.
That's the perfect place to leave it for today. Think about that. The power of writing things down. It brings order, authority, clarity. But could it also, as Frazer suggests, inadvertently shackle thought? Free something that was once evolving? Is that tension between the fixed text and evolving understanding still something we grapple with today? In law, in religion, in all sorts of areas? How do written rules serve as both a vital foundation and sometimes a limiting boundary? Definitely something to mull over.